We are. It's been a mighty long time, all so many years since we were here with that sudden rush for wealth. Do you remember?
I do. That race for wealth. Gold.
That's right. The gold rush. The California gold rush. As a matter of fact, Brett, how was it that you came out this way?
It's an interesting story, Sam. Of course, I think I should introduce myself to these fine folks here. My name is Bret Hart. How many of you fine folks, now be honest, know who Bret Hart is?
Heard of it.
Heard of him. Sort of heard of him. What do you know about Bret Hart? None. What? Author. Well, I was privileged to be out here in California in the 1850s and 1860s when gold was discovered, and it was a very, very exciting time. And I wrote about it. In fact, many people called me the first cowboy poet. I was the first true Western writer. I reinvented the American short story. And for you young folks, I was the rock star of the Victorian age. Rock star. In all modesty. Now,
Good job. As I recall, Brett, you were the father of modesty.
yes, I was. Now, I came out here in 1853. I was 17 years old. I was really the most unlikely choice of person to come out to California back then. You see, I grew up on the East Coast. And I was kind of sickly as a kid, bookish, sensitive, delicate. My real name is Francis Bret Hart, but the kids made fun of me. They called me Fanny. Yeah. But that was okay. I had my first poem published in a New York City newspaper when I was 11 years old. When I was 12 years old, I wrote a tragedy. Yep. My mother, she gave me books. Don Quixote was my favorite book when I was growing up. But, like many people back then, I had that lust for gold. So, I had a couple of choices to get to California back then. Some people got on a ship on the East Coast and went all the way down to the southern tip of South America, all the way up the western coast of South America, up to the western coast of California, and then inland. Took 6 months on a ship. Can you imagine what life was like 6 months on a sailing ship? Can you imagine what the food was like on that ship? I don't think it was anything as good as what you've got there. Can you imagine the disease? The restroom facilities? Ooh. Don't even want to think about it. But I didn't go that way. I took a ship down to Central America, Panama, and then crossed 50 miles of jungle, and then came up the west coast. It was a lot shorter. It was about 4 months. Crossing that jungle in 1853, cholera, dysentery. People died in that jungle, died in that fierce race for wealth. There was another way you could get to California back then. You could go overland, but you really had to time it perfectly. You had to leave late enough so that you didn't hit the spring storms, but early enough that you could cross the mountains before the snow hits. And that was a challenge. Did you go that way, Sam?
I came out by overland stage in 1861, Brett. You see, I had to come by stage. That's because the Transcontinental Railroad weren't built yet. That wasn't built till 1869. Now, if that rail line had been built, well, I'd have come out west by rail. You see, railroad is the safest way to travel. Why, it's safer than walking. It's safer than riding a horse. There's been much news made lately about railroad accidents. But you know what, Bret? It is a known fact that most people die in bed. While the railroads are safe, it's in bedrooms you gotta watch out for.
And you do, Sam, you do. Yeah, so I came out here when I was 17. I'd left school when I was 13, but I was well read. So I came out here, I tried tutoring. There were some rich ranchers, needed their sons tutored. I tried that for a while. I was a school teacher. Remember, I got a job on a stagecoach. They called the job messenger. That meant I rode shotgun, guarded the safe box, the gold. Can you imagine? Fanny, guarding the safe box. That didn't last long. That was not a good job for me. In fact, the fella before me got shot, and the fella after me got shot and killed.
Now that there is downsizing the hard way.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it is. But the fierce race for gold. I remember this poem I wrote. Want to hear a little bit of Dickens in Camp? It goes like this. Above the pines, the moon was slowly drifting. The river sang below. The dim Sierras, far beyond, uplifting their minarets of snow. The roaring campfire with rude humor painted the ruddy tints of health on haggard face and form that drooped and fainted in the fierce race for wealth. Gold, gold. I'd befriended a guy who knew a miner. Said, you ought to go out into the minefields. Now the Mother Lode, that was that narrow strip of foothills along the Sierra Nevadas that was just rich with gold. So one day, I decided I was going to go try my luck at gold mining. My destination was Jackass Hill in Tuolumne County. The Gillis boys were there. 40 miles I walked in varnished leather shoes that were so torn up when I got there, I had to wrap up my feet in handkerchiefs. Carried a Moroccan dressing case. I got there, I was so tired, I was dirty, I was dead broke. I had a revolver on my hip, but it wouldn't even hang right. It just kept bouncing all over the place. The Gillis boys, they looked at me, and they just laughed. Shook their heads. And they said, now, this isn't a good job for you, but if you want to try it, that's fine. And after 3 days, they sent me on my way with a loan of a $20 gold piece and the best wishes and good luck back to San Francisco. Then I went back to tutoring. I went up to Humboldt County in Northern California. That was a fine place up there. In fact, they had a little newspaper called the Northern Californian. And for $16 a month, I was known as the printer's devil. And that meant I set up the presses and all the ink. It was the dirtiest job you can ever imagine. But they let me write for the newspaper. Finally, I'd found something that I really enjoyed. In fact, I found I was good at it. And when the editor would go away, for whatever reason back then, he'd put me in charge. Then there was this one day in 1860. Number of the Native American tribes were having a religious ceremony. We called it Indian Island. There was some rumbling in town, like maybe there might be some trouble. So a group of the townspeople grabbed clubs and axes and went out to Indian Island and massacred 60 women and children. I was outraged. I was outraged. And in the next edition of the Northern Californian, I wrote, there can be no palliation for the slaughter of women and children. There can be no reason for the murder of babes. You know what happened after that? I got run out of town in no small danger. Yes, indeed. Townsfolk didn't take kindly to my writing about my outrage, but that was okay. Back to San Francisco. San Francisco. It's a great town today, and it was a great town back then. In fact, San Francisco at that time had more newspapers than any city in the world except for London. So I went to San Francisco, and I found what a wonderful place it was for writers, for artists. And I made a good friend, a woman by the name of Jessie Benton Fremont. Maybe you've heard of her husband, John the Pathfinder Fremont. Later became a well-known politician in California. Well, Jessie took me under her wing. And the first thing she did, she got me a government job. Now you know what that meant, don't you?
That meant you didn't have to work very much.
That's right. I had plenty of time for writing, and I did. About this time I started signing my pieces Bret Hart. Bret Hart. Now you have to understand, this was the Victorian age, where everything was very prim and very proper. But I had spent a lot of time traveling around the foothills and the mother lode, and the mining camps, and the little towns and villages and hotels. And I saw what life was like out here. And I started writing about real people, flaws and all. The gentleman gambler with heart of gold. Why, the lady of the night who cared for her fellow man.
One of my favorite characters in your stories.
Mm-hmm. The unschooled miner, deep in the knowledge of life. So I started writing, and people started reading. Soon I started up my own newspaper called the Californian. Very successful. Wonderful little literary pieces in it, essays.
And how old were you?
When I started the Californian, well, I'm 174 now. Let me think back. I think I was 26 or 27.
Very young.
I was young then, but old, wise.
You know, Brett, you still look young for your age. You know, the other day I had a compliment, a wonderful compliment.
What was that, son?
A young lady came up to me and she said, why, Mr. Twain, you look 100 years old. I said, my dear, I haven't had a compliment like that in 75 years.
Yeah. So this newspaper was 16 pages long, fine, pure white paper, the finest literary pieces. For $1, you could get a subscription for a whole year. Pretty soon, I needed to hire a reporter. Well, I looked around and I looked around, and then one day, I gotta tell you, this guy walks in. He's got this droopy mustache, bushy eyebrows, careless dress, this air of supreme indifference. But I hired him anyway. You remember that, Sam?
Yes, I do, Brett.
Seems to me like You were over in Nevada and you kind of left in a big hurry. What was that all about?
Well, you see, Bret, I went bust over there prospecting. It went like this. In August of 1861, you see, my brother Orion and I, we arrived in Carson City, Nevada, a little town nestled at the toe of the slope of the mighty eastern Sierra Nevada. As soon as I got there, I did something most relatives are known to do now and then.
So,
I borrowed as much money as I could from my brother Orion. Well, I needed a grub stake. I bought bacon and beans, hardtack, coffee and sugar. Plenty of that Comstock sarsaparilla. Oh, yes. I was about supplied up. In fact, I bought myself a miner's pick and a shovel. I was about ready to head out for the gold fields of Aurora. But there was just one more thing, Bret. You see, I figured that I should have a horse to ride. Everybody in that town rode a horse. I'd never seen such magnificent horsemanship as that displayed every day by those Mexican vaqueros in California on the streets of Carson. My, how they rode. Nonchalant in the saddle, just slightly out of the perpendicular, broad hat brim blowed square up in the front, long riata swinging overhead. They swept through that town like the wind. Next minute, they was a sailing puff of dust off on the far, far sagebrush desert. My, how I envied them. I was determined to have a horse. I was determined to buy a horse. Right about the time that was rankling around in my mind, an auctioneer come into the plaza, dragging behind him a creature with as many bumps and corners on him as a dromedary camel, and twice as ugly. But he was going for $23.50, gentlemen, for the horse, bridle, and the saddle. Right at that moment, a man whom I did not know, but who later turned out to be the auctioneer's brother, noticed the wistful look in my eye. He observed to me, I take it you are a stranger in this here camp. And you may very well think that that horse right there is an American horse. But I know that horse. I know him very well indeed. And I can assure you he is no such thing of the kind. He is, without the shadow of a doubt, a genuine Mexican plug. That's what he is. Well, I had never heard of a Mexican plug before. You see, I've been a riverboat pilot on the mighty Mississippi River. I just recently learned the difference between a cow and a horse. I was anxious to learn a little more about it. Well, I asked him, I said, does he have any other points about him? Well, that stranger put his thumb in the pocket of my shirt and led me over to one side. And then he breathed these words into my ear. He can outbuck any horse in the entire Nevada territory. He can outbuck any horse in America. He can outbuck any horse in the entire world. I'd already made up my mind inwardly I should have a genuine Mexican plug or die. Right about that time, while the auctioneer yells out, 25, 25, 27 and silver coin. Sold. I gladly paid my money for that horse. I proudly led him on over to the livery so he could rest himself up and dine out for a while. Later that afternoon, I brought him back into the plaza, where certain helpful citizens held him by the head, while others held him down to earth by the tail. I boarded that horse along the starboard side. As soon as I was mounted, Why, they let go. He put all of his feet in one bunch together. Then he let his back sway down, like pulling back the spring of a mighty bow. Then he let go with a sudden arch. It shot me in the air about 180 feet, like an arrow. Well, I went straight up. I wasn't used to such things. I came down, straight down, right back in the saddle. Then he sent me up a second time. Next I landed astride his neck, grabbed hold of the hair, and hung on. Then he decided to walk around on his hind legs for a while like a congressman. Then he went up the other way. He walked around on his hands for a while like a schoolboy. The whole time kicking at the sky with his hind feet. Well, I did a somersault back off his neck, hit the pommel, landed straight back in the saddle. Then he put all four back together again and sent me up for a third time. Just as I was leaving the saddle, I heard somebody say, "Don't he buck though?" So that was bucking. I was very glad to know about it. Not that I was enjoying it, but I had taken a certain general interest in it, and I was very glad to know the name of it. When I came back down, well, somebody hit that horse with a thwack with a leather strap. When I arrived, why, the horse wasn't there. He'd gone clean out of the territory. Well, he darted away like a telegram. He flew over 3 barbed wire fences like a bird, jumped over a stack of telegraph poles the size of a church, headed straight down 6 Mile Canyon, all the way to Washoe Valley, halfway to Dayton, Nevada. Well, I didn't ride that horse no more after that.
I don't think so.
I was internally, externally, eternally, and universally broke up, stove up, and all gone to pieces. I put one hand on my head and the other on my stomach. If I'd had 16 hands, Bret, I'd had a place for every one of them. Well, I didn't ride that horse no more after that. I just loaned him out. The folks that might be needing exercise. Everybody I loaned him to got plenty of exercise. One time I loaned him to a county clerk. He had to drag that horse back behind the wagon on the way to town. Later on I tried to sell him, but no one was buying. Well, folks said that earthquakes was common enough out here on the Pacific coast. They did not wish to own one. Later I tried to give him away, but that was a failure too. Well, walking was good enough exercise for a man like me, you know, one all stove up with internal injuries and such. Well, I walked to Aurora. When I got there, you see, I expected prospecting to go easy. I figured to pick the gold up off the top of the ground in large pieces. Nuggets the size of brass doorknobs. I soon came to find out that pipe dream didn't quite pan out the way I thought it would. But I learned that you had to dig down deep with a miner's pick and a long-handled shovel for the silver and the gold. I didn't have no use for a long-handled shovel. That's because I was born lazy. I'm no lazier now than I was 140 years ago. That's because I reached the limit 140 years ago. You can't go beyond possibility. Besides, I never did like work, even when somebody else does it. Not long after that, my mining partners and I, we were still holding on to the dream that we would strike it rich. Well, we would become millionaires and retire in the East. You see, we would ride in finest carriages. We would live in sumptuous mansions. We would have every luxury that life requires. We lost our shirts. We lost the claims. You see, we hadn't done the necessary assessment work as required by law. And by law, we had to forfeit them. Those claims came into the possession of a new mining company named the Wide West. The Wide West, soon to become the richest gold and silver mining company in the entire Nevada Territory. I realized that I had just been drunk on the smell of somebody else's cork. But I was young and undaunted. I figured, my partner and I both figured we would stake ourselves a timber claim. We headed up to the shores of Lake Tahoe. We camped out there for a period of 3.5 weeks. The water there was so perfectly clear, why you could see down to a depth of 65 feet. Yes, you could see every boulder, every rock, the pebbles, even the grains of sand. Why, it was nearly impossible to fish there because the trout could see the line, the hook, the bait, and they knew that it was a counterfeit. We'd drift along there offshore. The entire landscape in perfect crystal clarity opened up below us as we drifted over. Why, it's as if we were sailing in the sky. One afternoon, I decided I'd get an early start on cooking supper. I went down to the boat to get supplies. I was just about packed up and ready to head back. But before I left to go to the boat, I started myself up a little cooking campfire. Then I went down. Well, I was down there just about ready to head back, and I heard Calvin yell out, "Sam, Sam, the fire!" I turned just in time to see that a Washoe zephyr had come up off the lake, a small wind, and it was picking up the embers and sparks out of that campfire and throwing them out into the dry vegetation. Well, I was landing the pine needles and the dry grass and the leaves. Everywhere it landed, it was starting little fires. Well, it started 20 little fires. I took my coat off and tried to go put it out, but it weren't no use. Calvin, he tried to help me, but we couldn't get it. All we could do is stand there and watch it spread helplessly. Well, it spread into the brush, the small trees, and it started climbing up the big trees where the wind got a hold of it. Blew it from tree to tree. Then we watched it cross the ridge line and drop into the next canyon and burn up the next ridge, the next canyon, and on, far as you could see. We watched that fire burn all afternoon into the night. Well, that night, the flames and the sparks were perfectly reflected in the mirror surface of Lake Tahoe. It was an eerie sight, one I shall never forget. We collapsed that night, and we slept with a sleep that does not refresh. You see, if I just had the presence of mind to never start a fire under windy conditions, if I'd had the common sense to clear around my campfire ring for a distance of 5 feet, why 10 would be even better, down to bare mineral soil, bare dirt. If I'd had the presence of mind to have a pail of water and a shovel right there to douse out trouble just in case. And most important of all, if I had never turned my back on that fire and left it unattended for 1 minute, if I had done all those things, I would still have my timber ranch today. But as it was, we had to watch our dreams of timber ranching go up in towering flames and thick black smoke. You know, Bret, the Sierras up here were filled with danger. You had to constantly be on the watch. Why, fire was always a problem. But you know, water sometimes was a problem too. In the spring, in the early snow melt, why, the rivers would fill. They'd run swift and deep and cold, and they were dangerous.
They were.
They could sweep a person away. You had to keep your eyes on the little ones at all times. You know, as I begin to remember a few things, I recall you wrote a story. You wrote a story about that.
I did indeed.
In fact, it was named The Luck of Roaring Camp. You know, Bret, that's one of my favorite stories. I never grew tired of hearing it. I wish you would tell that story.
I'd be happy to tell that story. These good folks would be happy to listen to it. The year was 1850. The forest was different back then. The trees were healthier, they were bigger, and there were fewer of them. And so an occasional fire through the forest was not a bad thing because the big trees could survive. and the little trees and the disease would be eliminated. Forest was a magical place back then. Still is today, but it was different back then. But the rivers, the rivers. Wild, untamed, unfettered by anything like a dam. And the place, a miner's camp in the Mother Lode called Roaring Camp. Roaring Camp. Few wooden structures, but mostly the miners stayed in tents. Why, there was one main street, which was just a dirty, dusty, rutted wagon trail in the summer. In the winter, it was just a sea of mud. Roaring Camp. Tuttle's. Tuttle's was the general store. Out back, you could buy supplies. Out front, that's where the miners gathered after sundown. A little bit of drinking, a little bit of gambling. Roaring Camp. The activity never stopped in Roaring Camp. That's why they called it Roaring Camp. It was loud, lots of activity. 100 miners, no women. Well, there was one woman, Cherokee Sal. She lived on the edge of camp in her own tents. And one day Sal announced she was with child. A few months later, the big day had arrived. Well, you have to understand, these miners were criminals, some of them, fugitives, some of them reckless, all of them desperate in that search for gold. But they were used to death. Like, one day, right out in front of Tuttle's, French Pete and Kanaka Joe gunned each other down, dead. Work didn't stop for that. With new life, miners stopped their work, and all of them gathered outside Sal's tents. They decided that someone needed to go in there and help Sal. They looked around. Stumpy. Why Stumpy? Well, it seems Stumpy had a family back east. In fact, he had a couple of families back east, so he knew about family matters. Stumpy, you go in there and help Sal. So outside, the miners, as you would expect, they were placing 3 to 5 odds on whether Sal would survive, and even worse odds on the baby.
They were the dangest fellers. They would bet on anything.
Yes, they would. But after a few hours, Stumpy came out. And Sal had not survived. But the baby did. Well, some of the miners said, we need to send away for some women because they know how to take care of babies. And others said, let's send this baby away somewhere in another camp where it can be properly taken care of. But you know, the miners thought, we can take care of this baby. We can do this. So one by one, they filed past a wooden candle box that Stumpy had placed the baby in. One by one, they filed by and looked at that baby. This was big news and big doings in Roaring Camp. Old Kentuck, he went by, he put his hands on the edge of the box, and perhaps in a spasm of pain, the baby reached up and grabbed his little finger. And old Kentuck said, why, you little cuss, he's a-wrastling with my finger. Then he smiled. Well, we're going to have some rules if we're going to take care of the baby. Stumpy had a back room in his cabin. They were going to keep it clean and whitewashed. Some of them sent away to San Francisco for frilly things like curtains, pretty things that babies might like. Some more rules. There'll be no cussing and no fighting in front of the baby. Ooh.
No gunfighting either.
No gunfighting, no fighting, and if you're going to hold on to the baby, you have to wash that day and you have to change your clothes. Well, for people like old Kentuck, that was a big problem. He sort of viewed clothing like a snake does its skin, only to be sloughed off with decay. Yeah, but they did. And then spring grew into summer, and each day they'd go out to the mines, and one of the miners would carry the baby out, and they said, well, we can't just keep calling it it. So Oakhurst, the gambler, said, let's call him the Luck. Maybe this baby will bring the camp luck. And it did. Each day they went out to the mines and they started producing gold again. Somebody would carry the Luck out, place him down on a blanket laid upon pine needles. Some of the miners would bring the Luck flowers and sweet honeysuckle. Those were glorious days. The miners realized that nature had become the Luck's playmate and nurse. And they started looking around at the forest, and they started smelling the sweet scent of pine. The camp was changing now, a regeneration, an awakening. Those were glorious days. But then summer grew into fall, and fall into winter. And there were heavy, heavy snows that winter. Come spring, the rains came. A lot of rain. One weekend in particular, the rains downpour, and the mighty banks of the North Fork leaped from its banks. Mighty river. Rushed into Roaring Camp, swept into the camp in the middle of the night. In the morning, the miners looked, and Stumpy's cabin was gone. And the hope, the joy, the luck of Roaring Camp had disappeared. A couple of miles downriver, a rescue boat came upon old Kentuck, crushed and broken, still clinging to the lifeless body of an infant. He looked up at his rescuers and asked, "Dead?" They looked down at him and said, "Yes, and you are dying too." And old Kentuck smiled again. And he said, "The Luck has taken me with him. You tell the boys back in camp that I've got the Luck with me now." And then this old miner, and is still clinging to the infant, slowly drifted down that shadowy river that flows forever to the unknown sea. But back in camp, the miners decided they had discovered something far more valuable than gold. They had discovered the Luck of Roaring Camp.
Thank you, Bret. I thank you so much, Bret. You know, you're right. The Sierras can be a very dangerous place. You have to always be on your toes. Of course, they're very beautiful as well. In fact, why the climate up there is, why it's salubrious.
That's a fine word.
I do not know what salubrious means.
Neither do I.
But it is a good and high-sounding word, and I intend to use it meaning no harm, whatever. Anyways, why the atmosphere up here in the high Sierras is healthy. Well, I believe that it can restore a mummy to perfect health and vigor. Not one of them ancient mummies, but one of the fresher ones. Well, anyway, I became a writer like you, Bret. You see, in my case, it started with the newspaper business, just like yours. After I lost my timber ranch and failed at gold and silver mining, I was down on my luck and had no show. I needed a job. Joe Goodman, the publisher and owner of the Territorial Enterprise in Carson City, Nevada, well, he offered me a job. Bret, it paid $25 a week. $25. That is $5 a day. Well, I had to take that job. I couldn't turn it down. You see, the best and most highly paid and skilled miners on the mighty Comstock lode were earning $4 a day. Why, $5 was a king's ransom. I took that job. My principal duties were to travel around to all the mines on the mighty Comstock lode and write up as many tall tales as I could invent about their prospects, all for the purpose of selling them mining shares to the unwary investors over there in San Francisco. I soon came to learn I had quite a talent for telling stretchers.
You still do, Sam.
Why, thank you, Bret. I learned, I invented I reported on all kinds of news. You see, why, if there wasn't enough going on in town, I just reported on what should have been going on, whether it happened or not. I wrote all kinds of stories. I wrote stories about hangings, shootings, robberies, social events, politics. I even wrote editorials. Well, you see, I did have to tell a few stretchers. Every newsman has to lie a little. That's the principal drawback of the profession, and the reason I left it. You see, I hold myself to a higher standard than George Washington. I am different than Washington. Washington he could not tell a lie. I can tell one, but I'm trying not to. Well, anyway, after about a year of that employment, on February 3rd of 1863, I wrote a dispatch from Carson City. I signed it, Mark Twain. Mark Twain. Suited me just fine. You see, it's an old riverboat term meaning barely safe running in risky water ahead. 2 fathoms of water, 12 feet, just barely enough water to float a riverboat on without running in the ground. You had to learn to read that river like a book. You had to steer by the shape of the river. Well, I soon came to find out that news business was filled with conflict and controversy. That was risky water. Not long after that, I struck up a newsprint argument with another reporter on a competing newspaper down in Carson City. I affectionately named him the Liar. Well, he responded with a nice, cordial, and polite invitation to a gunfight on the streets of Virginia with long Colt pistols. Well, Bret, after 1 or 2 shots of that Comstock sarsaparilla, I began to think that was a pretty good idea. And after a few more shots, I thought it was a very good idea, and I told all my friends at the Washoe Club, gentlemen, I will meet the challenge. I will see him tomorrow on the streets of Virginia. We will settle our differences as gentlemen. The next morning, I realized that I had changed my opinion. After some rather strong advice from my friend Steve Gillis, my other friend Dan DeQuill, and some very strong encouragement from the local sheriff, well, I decided to do the most prudent thing a gentleman can do, Bret.
What's that?
I left Virginia City the next morning by overland stage for San Francisco by way of Placerville. Steve came with me. We weren't down there very long. We got ourselves in trouble down there.
Oh, what did you do?
Well, you see, you know how exciting those mining camps were. Why, there were so many good stories there. When I got down to San Francisco, why, it was boring. There was nothing to really write about. So I decided to write about, well, the police mistreatment of the Chinese immigrants. You see, they would just stand by and let crimes happen to the Chinese and never do anything about it. So I wrote stories about that. Wasn't long after that I was arrested for disturbing the police. Well, they called it public drunkenness. How dare they? As I recall, Bret, you wrote yourself an open letter too. It
Oh.
had something to do with the end of the Civil War.
Civil War, yeah. It was an interesting time in California. You know, in San Francisco, the town was split. And if you were in favor of the Confederacy, you hung a Confederate flag from the top of your house. And if you were in favor of the Union, you would hang up a Union flag. And in 1861, I still hadn't made it yet. My sister and I, we cut out squares of flannel shirts and we sewed ourselves a Union flag and hung it proudly on the top of our house. And during the war, I wrote 35 poems, all in favor of the Union side. These poems were read in churches and town halls all across the country. Then the war ended. And in 1866, the leading citizens of San Francisco decided they were going to have a parade, a 4th of July parade. One condition: only the white soldiers could march in that parade. Well, I wrote an open letter to all the black soldiers. And I said, you know, in war, we were equal when our blood blended. And we were equal when our faces were black with gunpowder. But in peacetime, we're no longer equal. I have to tell you, Sam, I was mighty upset because I believe that people should be treated fairly, no matter who they were. I didn't romanticize about the Chinese, the Native Americans, the Mexicans. I just believed that you gave each man respect. But that was my tale from the Civil War days. So tell us some more about how you became a writer.
You know, Bret, that was a multicultural experiment out here. Why, a man's freedom was largely determined by how well he could handle a Colt revolver and a Bowie knife.
And a beer pitcher.
And a beer pitcher. Exactly. Why, you know, it's interesting. Why, in San Francisco there was a plenitude of prejudice, and I didn't like it. Why, take the San Francisco police. Why, they had an air of superiority. They truly believed that they inhabited the lofty heights of all creation, far above all the other animals, even the jackass. Why, some held that they were equal to the jackass. But I always felt that that insulted the jackass. See, it wasn't long after that that I began to draw my opinions of the human race. Man is the only animal that feels malice. He is the only one that's capable of inflicting pain on others just for the sheer pleasure of it. Oh, but he is a religious animal. He is the only religious animal. He's the only one. He's got the true religion. Several of them. Man is the only animal that blushes or needs to. Sometimes I think that God invented man because he was disappointed in the monkey. After all, Bret, you just have to understand, he was made at the end of the week's work when God was tired. Well, not long after that, Steve was walking home one night, right outside Big Jim Casey's saloon. He heard a racket going on in there. Big Jim Casey was in there just beating the tar out of some poor innocent chap. Well, you know, Steve was, well, he always stuck up for the underdog. He ran in there and said to Big Jim, hey, why don't you stop? Big Jim said, all right, I will, but I'll finish the job on you, Steve. And he went after Steve